So in Germany, it is 6 o'clock p.m. I wish a good evening to everybody, a good day if you're attending from the United States. My name is Ilka Parent, to those of you who don't know me, and I definitely want to thank you so much for being here right now for this book introduction. I will add, I was so excited when I finally finished the book that I'm like, yay, I'll do a book introduction. And I'm a terrible, terrible public speaker. The whole day I've been so nervous because to me, when I speak to people, I just, I'm not very good at it. Okay. I'm good one-on-one. I'm good with the horses, but speaking like this is extremely anxiety laden for me. So please forgive me if I mess up. Because I know my mind sometimes is so, it goes all over the place. I've actually typed up what I'm going to say, and I hope you will forgive me that I'm reading it. But this way I stay structured, and this way I hope the information is concise and informational. And I'll put the paperwork away when I'm opening up for questioning. Okay? So I wrote this book, Seeing Horses, and how did this come about? Well, for 20 years, I've been involved in equine-assisted psychotherapy, and I've been involved longer with horses ever since I was two. I'm over 50. And I've been working as a clinical psychologist and trauma therapist with people. And so part of what I just described of me not being comfortable to speak in front of a lot of people, my mind is typically so full that I need to write. And a while ago, a friend of mine was like, gosh, you post so much on social media. Why don't you make the information more concise and put it in a book? So I had some free time for other reasons, and I was like, well, it's a good time to organize it. And lo and behold, this book came about. So it is an it reflects a desire of mine, all my writings, all my thought processes. I'm constantly preoccupied with how to better options of working with horses and humans. That's the origin of the book. And so what I will do in this presentation or in this book reading is give you a short content review of what is actually in the book. And there's certain themes. So I'm going to give again a short description of the themes because they're heartfelt issues for me. And after that, I'm going to read a few select passages. I'm hoping overall I have 10 pages that I typed up, but it's written in large print so I can read it while I'm talking to you. I'm hoping that overall it's going to take about 30 minutes. So, Seeing Horses is not only a book about horses, but about perception itself. How knowledge, language, and integrity must realign for any interspecies relationship to become ethically and structurally sound. That's my prerogative in this book. I structured the book in a systematic progression, and it's even though I used a lot of the core contents of my social media posts, it is not a loose compilation. Its structure is deliberately cumulative. Each section redefines, hopefully, if I succeed, the reader's perception, moving from factual knowledge about horses to the more philosophical and ethical consequences of seeing them. My hope is that the sequence functions like a deepening spiral from external observation toward internal integrity. As far as the sections that I cover, the first one is the orientation and critical grounding. In the opening chapters, I establish the conceptual stance. I examine, or the chapters examine, how the equine-assisted field has been shaped more by psychological and human-centered perspectives that, even if they're benevolent, often instrumentalize the horse. I want to add to this is not scripted. I've been such a strong proponent of equine assisted services, and personally, I believe it's It's the best form of working with people because horses are just so much more authentic and congruent than we humans can ever be. And even in my background is clinical psychology, and initially over 20 years ago when I started in this field, I was so convinced of doing the right thing. And the more I've done it, the more I realize that simply by having psychologists or teachers or, excuse me, social workers or anybody in the helping profession work with horses, it is so human focused. And there's not many models who employ equine behavioral specialists, as I call them, at the same time on the team. And even if in the teamwork an equine behavioral specialist is present, because of the dominance, and I use this word deliberately, because of the dominance of working with a so-called mental health professional and specialist, I find that oftentimes it humanizes everything and it psychologizes everything, losing sight of course, even though the word allegedly is the main factor in the equation. So these first few chapters clear the ground by I'm challenging the anthropomorphism and I'm challenging the professional roles and the methodological assumptions that dampen and change the horse's reality. Because every time I look at a humanized version on any other non-human being, that's not their reality. From here, I define the ground of reference, the foundations, I call the foundations of equine knowledge. I start with evolution, biology, and then proceed through welfare, housing, feeding, anatomy, and health, and accumulate in the central importance of movement, prophylaxis, and emergency care. Not very detailed, but I've also found giving trainings that a lot of times people don't even know the core requirements that it takes to house or to have or be around horses. And in my personal learning, in the United States, when I lived there, I know, well, about 15 years ago, it was so easy to have horses on the property, and there was no you had a horse, you put it on the property, and that was fine. Moving to Germany, it changed because here everything is ruled by regulations and things, standards that need to be met, and inspections and stuff. And I actually had to take a course to become certified to be able to have horses in my possession. I hate to use that word, but in my possession on my property. And as aggravating as it was to study for this exam, it was tons and tons and tons of books and videos and stuff. I took out the parts that I think are very, very important for everybody to know. The intention of me presenting these core requirements is to reestablish equine knowledge as a precondition for ethics, though. There's a lot of good books, there's a lot of good information out there on these standards, but I deliberately use them to define the ethics of working with horses. My aim was to present physiology and welfare not as a technical background, but as core knowledge. And I've kept to observable knowledge, referring to research while highlighting the faultiness of it. Because any kind of research, again, is human-based, human-oriented, with human standards that we're putting on non-human beings. From there, I move and shift from the structure to relationship. In the coming chapters, I address how movement, stress, communication, and learning form the behavioral grammar through which horses and humans interact. Horses are physical beings and they communicate through their body, something that we as humans have often forgotten, even though we do, and we read it, we respond to it, but we're so focused on thinking and speaking and putting the constructs that we have in our head into words and communicating this way that we often forget and, yeah, overlook what is really being communicated. Communication is redefined as an exchange of perceivable behavior within a shared field, not as an emotional projection. I think this is very important when it comes to the equine-assisted field because so much is working with constructs of metaphor, of language that the horses somehow need to fit in or the horses are being used for. Stress, learning, and conditioning are analyzed as dynamic processes. Again, the dynamic between beings, each one affecting trust, clarity, and welfare for all involved. I mention what's often here, and one may misunderstand that I'm only focused on equine welfare, which is a huge topic. And I think here I'm being very confrontative. I think a lot of times it misses the point. I'm talking about welfare for all the beings, everybody involved. In one of those chapters, I introduce agency, the idea that both horse and human possess independent capacity for self-initiated action. That's a big one because, again, coming from the psychological field, another paradigm shift is required because patients and clients are often fit into categories to where we have one expert and we have one non-expert. And so agency is a core requirement in my work where I use the quadrant approach and where I formalize it. There's 4 pillars in a cube: horse or horses, a mental health specialist, an equine behavioral specialist, and a person seeking services. And each one bears responsibility for their own structural integrity. I will address this a little bit later, also when I read parts of the book, because that's a heartfelt standard of mine that defines a lot or most of the work that I do. From there, we move into trauma, language, and ethics. Why did I put trauma in there? In part because I needed to revise some of my earlier books. Traumatology is a field that changes daily. Okay, so I needed to just revise some of the statements I've made 10 years ago in some of my books and add on to it. So part 3, this trauma, language, and ethics marks the transition from observing equine behavior to understanding the human condition that meets it. I begin with a picture that you may have seen on Facebook, the Penrose staircase, as a thought experiment about perception and observation, how the act of looking itself shapes what becomes visible, and how unseen structures influence what we believe we perceive. I also put it in there because every time we enter the field, you hear me talk about fields, dynamics, fields, interactions. Every time we enter a field, we become part of it. So every time we work with horses, if we really truly see horse and what the horse communicates and who the horse is, we need to take into account that we have a direct effect on them as well, and not just the person seeking services. From there, I turned toward trauma, which I described not as an event, which is a big one. I have a lot of discussions about that, but as an organism's overwhelmed inability to respond, most often resulting in disconnection from either self or surroundings or both. Language to me is a focal point. The way we name experiences defines what becomes visible or hidden. To me, ethical responsibility begins in linguistic precision, whether we describe human or non-human beings. From there, we shift into another big chapter or a series of chapters where I challenge the reader by sharing essential lessons that I learned while working with horses and humans. The chapters implicit inequality, being with, not doing for, and integrity form a continuous argument that genuine change and ethical practice emerge only when each participant maintains their own integrity and respects the self-determination of others. In conclusion, I repeat my call for a paradigm shift from psychology-centered intervention to shared ethical coexistence. The horse is not a method, but a being whose integrity must remain intact within human practice. In my book, there's several themes that are being looked at from various aspects in that structure that I described to you. And again, I would like to just briefly describe each one of them. So the first one is seeing as an ethical perception. Seeing is the book's central verb. It represents perception without appropriation, observation without projection. The act of seeing is redefined as an ethical encounter, one that requires restraint, clarity, and self-responsibility. I'd like to add here that to me, English is my third language. And in each language that I speak, I have this tendency to take words apart because I think, again, the importance of language that I just addressed is it's just there. And my background is psychoanalysis, where each nuance, each word, each body gesture means something, gives access to the subconscious. And at one point throughout the years on Facebook, I heard the word game where responsibility was taken apart into ability to respond. And it has become my definition of responsibility. So every time I mention it, this is what I'm referring to, the ability to respond. Integrity as structure, what do I mean by that? I've mentioned it several times now, and integrity is the underlying principle that holds the entire book together. At least I hope it is being perceived as well, but that was my intent. It applies on every level to the body in the sense of health and welfare, to communication in the sense of truthful and accurate observation, and, which is again important, to ethics in the sense of acting without using others as means to an end, in the sense of not instrumentalizing horses, in the sense of not humanizing horses simply because we work with humans and horses. And it is this quality that keeps knowledge, perception, and behavior, at least in my opinion, in honest alignment. From using to relating. Okay, I already touched on that when I talked about the integrity, but the text exposes how equine-assisted work, though often motivated by care, has perpetuated the utilitarian use of horses. The paradigm shift moves from using the horse for human healing, which needs to be in quotation marks because I don't believe in it, to relating to the horse within a shared field. This is important, not just relate in terms of empathy, which a lot of times is projection again, but to relating to the horse within a shared field that each one of us and them occupy. And this field needs to be one field defined by respect and self-boundaried awareness. The quadrant approach and balance. I don't know if you can see my arrow, but this is the cube that I was referring to. It's an essential integral part of the PEAT model. The PEAT stands for psychodynamic equine-assisted trauma therapy. This is the model that I work with. And on this picture, you can see that there's 4 pillars. I designed this cube with the help of a good friend of mine because I was against the triangle. I was taught in the EGALA model. I taught the EGALA model as a trainer for many years. And we always depicted the interaction with just the MH and the equine behavioral specialist and the horses against one client in a triangle, and there was shifts and who was interacting with the client. But to me, it didn't make sense because a triangle cannot stand on the tip, and being on the tip is pretty lonely if you're the only one there. And so for me, the reference when working with a person, and we showed up as a team with equine behavioral specialist and me as the mental health professional, and then working with horses, 3, 4 horses and one person, it was pretty intimidating. So again, to me, back then, this was several years ago that I came up with the cube with the help of a friend of mine. I try to envision something, what does it take to balance this out? In the cube, what I really like is that no matter what side the cube falls on, it's always stable and everybody is always adding to the stability. So the Pete model provides the structural metaphor of equality. Here I do use metaphor because it does not involve horses. It transforms hierarchical therapeutic dynamics into a balanced cube where no pillar carries another. The model makes visible how imbalance arises when rescue, fusion, or projection occur. Why is that? I will explain that briefly because when a projection occurs either from the mental health professional or the equine behavioral specialist, by not being able to see the horse, but by seeing the horse only within our own framework, it crumbles. And an imbalance happens then because then the horse is not being fully acknowledged for who he or she is, and that pillar is non-existent then. I already addressed language and I added power here. Throughout the book, language is shown to be a structural force. It can either distort or clarify what is real. Human-centered, sentimental, or metaphorical phrasing reproduces inequality, while precise observational language maintains accuracy and preserves the other's reality. As I mentioned, trauma is being addressed about, and the theme is trauma as disconnect or as disconnection. Trauma is not defined by the external event, but by what happens inside the organism when it becomes unable to respond. It is a collapse of connection, first within the body's regulatory system, then between the individual and the environment. When the nervous system is overwhelmed beyond its capacity for action or integration, perception and movement separate. Perception and body separate. The person remains alert to threat, but disconnected from his or her own agency, the ability to respond. This disconnection extends beyond physiology. Thought, emotion, and communication fragment, making ordinary relational engagement impossible. I truly, in this book and in my life, emphasize that trauma is therefore not weakness, but an adaptive mechanism that preserves survival under unbearable conditions. Change begins when responsiveness returns, when awareness, movement, and communication can once again align. In this sense, recovery is not about reliving the event, which often happens during trauma confrontations or which is often understood as something that one does in trauma therapy, but about restoring connection, coherence, and the lawful ability to act. I added lawful because that again is agency, and to me it is something that no one can be given. No one can be given agency by another being. We can obviously restrict it or take it away, but agency is something that comes from deeply within that every being has the right to. Every being has the right to and can have the ability to execute. Knowledge is understood, moving on to knowledge, the theme knowledge as an ethical form of awareness. Knowledge is understood as a form of ethical clarity rather than responsibility in the moral sense. To know means to see what is accurately and to perceive without distortion and to act in accordance with what is real. A lot of times when we project, we don't see what really is. We define, we interpret immediately, we attribute meaning to things. To see without doing that, to see what is difficult, I think. Scientific and ethological understanding are presented as instruments of integrity. They allow us to recognize what is present, not to control it. The book contrasts informed perception with well-intentioned ignorance, showing that empathy without understanding can still lead to harm, great harm actually. True knowledge is therefore not about authority or correctness, but about alignment, a disciplined way of seeing that prevents misuse and preserves the integrity of all involved. Another theme is being with, not doing for. This is actually something that I will read to you in a little bit. But just to summarize it, the principle summarizes the ethical stance of Pete. Presence instead of control, coexistence instead of intervention. It applies equally to horses and humans, to everybody involved, marking the end of the rescue paradigm. And why do I keep referring so much to rescue? Because there's so many providers out there, so much advertisement out there that promotes horses healing humans. Healing. Okay, a lot of times in my private practice, people come to me with the expectation that I will heal them, that I will do for them, that I will have the answer for them. And so I'm being very, very critical of the term, another word, of the term healing and of the intention of being, or the allegation of being able to supply that. Then I come back to the paradigm shift. Maybe you've read that on Facebook before, how I posted it, or social media in general, that we need a paradigm shift. And my final theme is systemic and philosophical. What I do envision and what I promote is a field where equine assisted practice becomes a site of mutual integrity, not human redemption. It is a call to dismantle humanized frameworks and to cultivate genuine relational ethics.